Hi students, this is Dr. Spellman, and today we're going to talk about immigration. In particular, we're going to be looking at Shafer-Landau's chapter on globalization and immigration, the introduction to chapter 17 of our book. At the beginning of that chapter, Shafer-Landau gives us some factual information, right? Introduces us to some of the empirical data that's relevant to this discussion. One thing he points out to begin with is that almost 3 billion people lack access to toilets, and almost 1 billion lack access to clean water. 179 million infants in the least developed countries fail to be protected from diseases by routine immunization. The point here is that out of the 8 billion people in the world, many of them, almost half, lack access to toilets. 1/7, 1/8 lack access to clean drinking water, and almost 200 million, right, don't have the immunizations they need to be safe from dangerous, deadly diseases. That's a situation that we're not faced with every day, right? We don't, it's not that an eighth of us lacks access to clean drinking water, or that 3 out of every 8 of us, right, don't have access to clean toilets. So we want to put sort of our situation into perspective relative to the least well-off. The good news, Shafer-Landau says, is that those of us in the developed world have the power to make a difference in the lives of those who are desperately poor. In 2008, the United Nations estimated that it would take about $30 billion per year to end world hunger. He points out that sounds like an enormous figure, but he says it's dwarfed by the $737 billion the United States Congress spends each year on defense. That's a ton of money that we're spending on defense, right? One, what is it, 1/20th of it? If we spent that instead on ending hunger, we could do it. He also points out that Americans spend $223 billion on alcohol each year. That's an incredible number, right? If we spent an eighth of that, so every 8 drinks, we, instead of taking a drink, we sent that money to world poverty relief, we could end world hunger. Those are pretty startling numbers. Now, Shafer-Landau says that while aid from people in developed countries can help the global poor, there's another way we can help them too, right? Say, I don't want to donate any of my money. Fair enough, right? So another thing you can do is give them the opportunity to immigrate. In particular, he says immigration provides an opportunity for people to escape the horrors of war. While refugees often find it difficult, at least initially, to thrive in a new land, there's little doubt that they're much better off immigrating than remaining in their war-torn countries. So again, this sort of emphasizes there these sort of 2 reasons for immigration. One is the potential economic gains that one can get from moving to a nearby country. 2, you might be wanting to move to a country to escape war or other dangers. A lot of people coming from Central America, right, are maybe fearing for their lives at the hands of drug cartels or something of that nature. There are other benefits of immigration that are economic, right? So there's the refugee case, and then Shafer-Landau points out that according to 2015 UN estimates, about 12 million people living in the US were born in Mexico. Half of those people were undocumented. So in many of these people's cases, right, they're leaving Mexico to come to the US to make money and send back to their families. What we're going to do in this video is take a look at the arguments against immigration. Now, in a sense, they're not arguments against immigration like saying like people shouldn't migrate, but rather they're saying they're sort of pro-immigration restrictions. So they're arguments for limiting immigration. In particular, we're going to look at 3 such arguments. The first is called the economics argument, the second is the security argument, and the third is the national self-determination argument. So each of these takes sort of a different kind of strategy at trying to defend the view that we can put restrictions on immigration. Now this, I should note, is in many ways like the common sense position, right? Almost all nations in the world have restrictions on immigration. And so we might expect these arguments to be relatively strong. And what we do as philosophers, right, is say that we're quick to point out that the arguments that we thought were justifying the sort of standard views are not as strong as we thought they were. So let's start with the first one, the economics argument. The first premise of that says that nations have a right to protect their economic interests. The second premise says that restricting immigration is going to do that. It's going to protect the economic interests of wealthier countries. The conclusion is that wealthier countries have a right to restrict immigration. So the argument's intuitive enough, right? The thought is when we let people in from other countries, that hurts our economy, that hurts our workers, and we have a right to protect our workers, to protect our economy from those harms. Now the first objection we're going to look at is an objection to premise number 2. So restricting immigration will protect the interests of wealthier countries. Is that true? As Shafer-Landau points out, restricting immigration will probably benefit. Restricting immigration, the restrictions will benefit the wealthy nation's least well-off members, right? Allowing immigration is going to be bad for them. But he says those restrictions may very well harm the nation's economy as a whole. And the reason for that is that when we allow immigration, we're allowing people to come work who will often work for less than the people, the citizens of the US will work for. And that means goods will cost less. So although a segment of the population might lose their jobs, somebody will still be doing those jobs, and as a result, other people will have to pay less for the goods and services that they're purchasing. So the emphasis here is on there's a sort of a distinction between the impacts that immigration restrictions have on the society as a whole and the impacts that they have on particular workers. You might think here about a difference between like Kantians and deontologists. So utilitarians will say, well, it doesn't matter that the least well-off members are losing their jobs. If it's good for the economy as a whole, then it's good. Whereas a Kantian might say, no, we can't sacrifice the least well-off workers for a net welfare gain for the whole economy. So what I've done here is I've just sort of modified the argument to sort of fix the problem so it's more explicit. So I've fixed P2, so now it says restricting immigration will protect the economic interests of a nation's least well-off members. If we make that change, though, we've got to change premise 1 as well. So now premise 1, to make the argument valid, says nations have a right to protect the economic interests of their least well-off members. Now when we look at this argument, premise 2 looks like it's true, right? It's an empirical claim, and it looks like it's definitely true. But the problem now is premise 1. So do nations have a right to protect the economic interests of their least well-off members? I think the question here is, so I say the question then is whether nations have a right to protect the economic interests of their least well-off members. Whether this is true seems like it's going to depend on how well-off those people are. So say the least well-off members of your nation are really rich, right? If they take a bit of a hit, big deal. It's really a benefit to the poor people who are crossing the border. And so in that case, we might be willing to let the wealthy take a hit so that the poor from overseas or the neighboring countries can get an economic benefit. But if the people in your country are really poor, then allowing other people who are poor to take their jobs might not be permissible. And so I think in a sense here, the question I think that someone who is more pro-immigration is going to say, well, there are ways that we could take better care of the least well-off members of society if we put in social safety nets and things of that nature. Then even a small harm to the least well-off members of our society is not going to be much of a harm because there's a safety net there to help them. All right, so let's set that argument aside. Turning to the security argument, premise 1 of that argument says, states have a moral duty to protect their citizens against dangerous attack. That sounds right. Premise 2 says restricting immigration is required to offer that protection. Conclusion, therefore states have a moral duty to restrict immigration. Now, as with the last argument, right, we're going to think about, well, which premise of this argument is the most controversial? Which one is the most vulnerable to criticism? And here we're going to start by looking at premise 2. So the claim that restricting immigration is required to offer protection to citizens. The objection goes like this. So we all agree that stronger restrictions on immigration are going to reduce the likelihood of a dangerous attack. But it's not clear, however, just how much those restrictions are going to reduce the likelihood. So if we didn't allow any immigration, it would be impossible for anyone from a foreign country to commit a dangerous attack, a harmful attack on US soil. But nobody's saying that we shouldn't let anyone into our country, right? We're certainly going to allow some risks of dangerous attacks in order to get the economic benefits from people moving into the country. And so I don't think anyone's suggesting that, right? Accordingly, we've got to modify the argument. So restricting immigration reduces the likelihood of a dangerous attack. I think that's a premise that sounds right. It's maybe not necessary to protect us, but it definitely is going to reduce the likelihood. And so we, again, have to change premise 1 accordingly. So premise 1 now says states have a moral duty to reduce the likelihood of a dangerous attack. But now premise 1 is more controversial. So here's the objection to premise 1. While reducing the likelihood of dangerous attacks is a worthy goal, there's got to be some point at which the effort it takes to reduce the likelihood is not worth the benefits. So it might be true that if we've got a bunch of people looking at passports, finding out the detailed history of the people who are coming into the country, depending on how safe those particular immigration from that particular country is, we're wasting time the more effort we put into limiting immigration. So we've got to find a nice, the thought would be we've got to find a nice middle ground. No one's suggesting that, we want to let dangerous terrorists into the country. At the same time, the thought is, well, if we relax those immigration restrictions, then we would get, most people aren't terrorists, right? We would get benefits to those people, we would get benefits as a country, and that would be good. So the security argument, right, whether or not that's successful is going to depend a bit on how good you think those objections are. And sort of how nervous you are about people immigrating from other countries. I think it's worth noting that we would really have to think carefully about how likely it is that someone's going to commit a dangerous attack, how safe we can be. Shafer-Landau points out that there's a way in which it may be impossible to prevent a dangerous attack if somebody's really set on attacking the United States. There are ways for them to get into the country. Finally, the last argument is the national self-determination argument. And I think in some ways this argument is the strongest. So, first premise of the argument says nations have a right to political self-determination. They have an ability to decide for themselves sort of who they're going to associate with. Premise 2, the right to self-determination includes a right to refuse association with others. The thought here is, right, if you've got a group you're starting, you're allowed to keep other people out of the group. Premise 3, a nation's right to refuse association with others includes the right to close its borders to potential immigrants and others. So if we can refuse people from joining our group, we're allowed to sort of create a fence. We've got some way of preventing people from joining our group. We can institute that. Therefore, nations have a right to close their borders to potential immigrants and others. That's the conclusion. Again, as usual, Shafer-Landau is going to think about, well, which of these premises looks most vulnerable? Where do we need to clarify things? And the first place to start with this argument is premise 1, the claim that nations have a right to political self-determination. Here's the objection. So the worry is that argument looks pretty good, but he points out the right to political self-determination can be trumped by a number of things. So one thing is the duty to aid people in need. So you might have a right to sort of refuse from letting people into your group, refusing to help other people other than the people in that group. But if people are truly in need, right, then the thought is we do need to help those people. And this goes back to sort of like the Lockean proviso that we talked about at the beginning of this whole unit on justice, right, where Locke says you have to leave as good and as much for others. So if you're hoarding all the goods and other people are in need, then you've got to help those people in need. The other way in which the right to political self-determination can be trumped is that sometimes we have a duty to rectify injustices. So if, for example, we harm people and then kick them out of our group, we might think, well, insofar as that was unjust, we need to let them back in. Or alternatively, right, if we're, throwing stones at people outside of our group and then we injure them and they need our help, then it seems like we've got to help them. And so oftentimes people in Central America are going to criticize the US, rightly so, oftentimes for the sort of economic policies that we've chosen that have harmed them or made it harder for them to flourish, them and their economies to flourish. And so there might be some claim that they have to our help insofar as the reason that they need help is on account of US policies. All right, so now that we've seen these arguments, the thing you want to think about, right, is which of these arguments seems the most promising to you? How would you object to that argument, and then how do you think you can respond to the objections that are given to that argument? That's the kind of thing that we want to be thinking about whenever we see these arguments, especially if you find this view plausible, that we should, it's permissible to have these relatively strong restrictions on immigration. You want to think about why is it that I think that those are justified? What are the objections to my view? And then how do I respond to those objections? Again, the 3 arguments we looked at this time were the economics argument that says allowing immigration is going to hurt the country economically, the security argument that says allowing immigration is going to harm our security, and then the self-determination argument, which says we're allowed to decide for ourselves who we're going to let in. Now, I think the strongest argument here is in many ways the self-determination argument. It's this ability to choose for ourselves who we want to associate with, that allows us to protect our economic interest, that allows us to protect our interest in security. But the question that we have to answer at the end of the day is just how much can we protect our economic interests? Just how much can we protect our interest in security? I think if taken to an extreme, we're going to find those positions untenable. So when someone charges a bunch of money to other people in a crisis for water, let's say, we think of that as price gouging and we think it's wrong. And so the same thing might be true in a case where a country is relatively wealthy, people trying to get into it are relatively poor. If you bar entry, it's kind of like price gouging or something like that. We all agree that nations can protect their security, but how interested can they be in their security? At a certain point, building up massive defenses of your location to prevent other people from getting in, especially when those people are under attack themselves, seems inappropriate. So again, you want to think about how strong are these arguments? Are they going to work? All right, that's it for this session. We'll see you next time with arguments for the pro-immigration side.